And this comes as President Trump dropped a bit of a bombshell this morning, canceling plans to sign a landmark housing affordability bill until he gets action on his controversial elections overhaul legislation. Cole Higgins has his reasoning why.
President Donald Trump visiting Capitol Hill Wednesday, but not signing a historic bipartisan housing bill as originally planned. Instead, opting to take the chance to pressure senators at a GOP lunch to pass his Save America Act.
I can't think of anything that is a better way to celebrate the 250th anniversary of this country than making it easier for people to pursue the American dream of home ownership.
Less than 2 hours before the president's planned signing, he posted on social media, "Today's housing news conference and signing is hereby canceled until such time as we pass the desperately needed Save America Act, which I consider to be a national emergency." That bill would tighten ID requirements to vote in U.S. elections.
We have to press for election integrity measures. That's why we've made it a top priority.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Adam. Mike Johnson blocks Trump's bill sounds explosive, suggesting a House revolt and a war between the Speaker and the President. But the reality of what actually happened is more complicated and far less dramatic than the headline suggests. But here's the thing, and this is really important to understand before you share that headline with anyone else. This headline is completely misleading. In fact, it's got the story almost perfectly backwards. Mike Johnson did not block Trump's bill. Trump and Johnson were actually on the same side. It was the MAGA hardliners who blocked Johnson's legislative strategy. The headline has this completely backwards. Let me be very clear about what actually happened on that House floor. Trump had a bill he wanted passed called the Save America Act. This is a voting restrictions bill that establishes a national voter ID requirement and restricts voting procedures.
Senator John Thune hit back at President Trump, who's raised doubts about whether he should remain majority leader.
He doesn't vote in our election.
The White House has said President Trump's patience with Thune is running out as the Save America Act remains stalled in the Senate.
Do you think he's still the man for the job?
Well, we're going to find out, and I'll let you know.
The bill would require proof of citizenship when registering to vote and a photo ID when casting a ballot. But it can't reach the 60 votes needed to pass since Democrats don't support it.
Trump knows he can't defend Republicans' abysmal record, so he whines for the GOP to pass the SAVE Act to disenfranchise voters.
President Trump argues Republicans have the votes to kill the filibuster, meaning bills would only need 51 votes to pass.
He's got the votes. He should get it done.
Senator Josh Hawley tells me he wants to see changes.
I think the filibuster has been so abused by the Democrats, and let's be honest, the Senate is not working.
But Leader Thune says there isn't enough support to change the long-standing rule.
There aren't going to be 50 votes to get rid of the legislative filibuster.
Trump wanted this bill passed. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, also wanted this bill passed. Trump and Johnson were on the same side. They both supported the Save America Act. They were aligned in their goals. They wanted the same outcome. But there's a group of hardline conservative Republicans in the House who believe that Johnson's strategy for passing the bill wouldn't work. These hardliners didn't think the Senate would pass the bill if it was paired with the defense authorization bill. So these hardliners froze the House floor and demanded that their way be used instead. The hardliners blocked Johnson's strategy, not because they opposed Trump, but because they thought Johnson's approach would fail. This is a completely different story from what the headline claims. The headline makes it sound like Johnson and Trump are on opposite sides. The headline makes it sound like Johnson is blocking Trump. But the reality is that Johnson and Trump were aligned.
Despite a big push by President Trump, the Save America Act has languished in the Senate. The bill would mandate a near total ban on mail-in voting. Congressional Republicans say the Save America Act would prevent voter fraud. Voting rights groups say the bill, which would require proof of citizenship nationwide in order to register to vote, is burdensome to voters. The bill also contains unrelated provisions targeting transgender athletes and children.
It's an outrageous bill, and we're going to fight it tooth and nail.
The legislation is still 7 votes short of the 60 needed in the Senate to move the bill forward.
We don't have the votes.
The conflict was between Johnson's strategy and the hardliners' preferred strategy. The headline is completely backwards. The headline is misleading. Let's talk in detail about what actually happened in the House and why the headline is so deceptive. First, you need to understand what the Save America Act actually is. This is Trump's voting bill. It's a national voter ID and voting restrictions package that Trump has made a top legislative priority. Trump wanted this bill passed. And yeah, voting restrictions are controversial. Some people support them, some people oppose them. But the important thing for understanding this story is that Trump wanted this bill passed and made it a priority. Now, Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the House. Johnson's job is to manage the House and try to pass legislation that the Republican majority supports. Johnson also wanted to pass the Save America Act. Johnson wasn't trying to block it. Johnson was trying to find a way to pass it. So Trump and Johnson were aligned. They both wanted the same thing. They both wanted the Save America Act to pass.
For House lawmakers to get the Save America Act across the finish line before they go on August recess next week. And you may remember that request is coming straight from the president. He urged Congress to get that done during his prime time address just last week. Here's how House Speaker Mike Johnson said what he had to say about the topic. He says it's very necessary.
These are very popular and important and necessary objectives. Number one, secure American elections by passing the Save America Act into law, as much of that as possible. That's the objective. He announced 280,000 non-citizens have been found to be on voter rolls in America. I mean, if that doesn't cry for the passage of the Save America Act into law, I don't know what does. He announced that foreign adversaries have compromised American election data and that our election system is vulnerable to threats. I mean, that should concern every American citizen. This isn't about relitigating 2020. This is about making sure that people have faith in our election system. If you do not have a free and fair election.
Now, Johnson came up with a strategy. Johnson wanted to pair the Save America Act with the annual National Defense Authorization Act. The defense bill is the roughly $1 trillion annual defense policy bill. This is a massive bill that handles defense spending and policies. Johnson thought that by pairing the voting bill with the defense bill, both bills could pass together. Johnson thought this was the best way to get both bills through the House and Senate. But some hardline conservative Republicans didn't think this strategy would work. These hardliners, led by Representative Anna Paulina Luna and others, believed that the Senate wouldn't pass the Save America Act even if it was paired with the defense bill. These hardliners believed that the Senate would strip out the voting bill and just pass the defense bill. So these hardliners didn't think Johnson's strategy would actually result in the voting bill passing. The hardliners thought Johnson was wasting time and effort on a strategy that would ultimately fail. So the hardliners came up with their own strategy. The hardliners froze the House floor. They refused to allow votes on Johnson's procedural rule. They demanded that leadership find a different way to advance the voting bill. They demanded that the voting bill be considered separately. They demanded Senate action on the voting bill before moving on to other legislation. So the hardliners paralyzed the House. They prevented votes. They prevented other bills from moving forward. And they forced Johnson to back down from his strategy. Now, here's what's really important to understand. This was not Johnson blocking Trump. This was hardline Republicans blocking Johnson's strategy because they disagreed with Johnson's approach. Johnson and Trump were both trying to pass the voting bill. The hardliners were also trying to pass the voting bill. Everyone wanted the same thing, but they disagreed about how to get there. The hardliners thought Johnson's strategy wouldn't work. The hardliners used their leverage in the House to force Johnson to change his strategy. And yeah, this worked. The hardliners forced Johnson to back down. In fact, Johnson had to cancel scheduled votes and send lawmakers home early for the July 4th recess. The House floor was paralyzed for a second consecutive week. Johnson couldn't move forward with his plan. The hardliners had won. The hardliners had forced Johnson to abandon his strategy. And this happened even though Trump supported Johnson's strategy. So the hardliners were basically overriding what Trump wanted in terms of legislative strategy. Now, this is the second time in a few months that House Republicans had revolted against Johnson. Back in February, there was another revolt where 3 Republicans joined Democrats to defeat Johnson's attempt to prevent House votes disapproving of Trump's tariffs. So Johnson's control of the House is very weak. With such a narrow Republican majority, just a few Republicans can block anything they want. They can force Johnson to change strategies. They can paralyze the House. And yeah, this shows how precarious Johnson's position is as Speaker. The revolt also had broader implications. The House floor shutdown prevented votes on the defense bill, foreign aid legislation, and other measures. Billions of dollars of legislation got held up because of this internal Republican revolt. The defense bill was stalled. Foreign aid was stalled. Other spending was stalled. All because hardline Republicans didn't like Johnson's legislative strategy on the voting bill. And the revolt continued as conservative Republicans kept demanding action on the voting bill and border security. So this wasn't a one-day thing. This was an ongoing revolt that paralyzed the House for weeks. Johnson's strategy was defeated. His authority was undermined. And the Republican agenda was stalled because of internal GOP conflicts. Let me break down what's true and what's false about this headline in clear, simple terms. First, Mike Johnson did not block Trump's bill. This statement in the headline is completely false. Johnson and Trump both supported advancing the Save America Act. Johnson tried to pass it by pairing it with the defense bill. Johnson was not trying to block the bill. Johnson was trying to find a path to pass it. The headline is completely wrong about Johnson blocking Trump's bill. Second, the actual revolt was hardline Republicans rejecting Johnson's legislative strategy, not MAGA rejecting Trump. This is the key part that the headline gets backwards. The hardliners rejected Johnson's plan to pair the voting bill with the defense bill. The hardliners thought the Senate wouldn't accept that strategy. The hardliners forced Johnson to abandon his strategy. But this wasn't hardliners rejecting Trump. Trump supported Johnson's strategy. The hardliners were overriding what Trump wanted in terms of how to proceed legislatively. Third, this was an internal Republican conflict, not a Johnson versus Trump conflict. The headline makes it sound like Johnson and Trump were on opposite sides, but they weren't. Both Trump and Johnson wanted the Save America Act passed. Both wanted the voting bill to be a priority. The conflict was over strategy and how to pass the bill. The hardliners disagreed with Johnson's strategy, but this disagreement didn't involve Trump opposing Johnson. Trump and Johnson were aligned on the goal. Fourth, this reveals significant weaknesses in Johnson's control of the House. With such a narrow Republican majority, just a few Republicans can block anything. Just a few Republicans can force Johnson to change direction. Just a few Republicans can paralyze the House. This is a serious vulnerability for Johnson's leadership. It also means that even Trump's support for a particular strategy isn't enough to guarantee that strategy passes. The hardliners had the power to override both Johnson and Trump. So what's really happening here? Trump wanted his voting bill passed. Johnson tried to pass it using one strategy. Hardline Republicans disagreed with Johnson's strategy and believed it would fail in the Senate. The hardliners paralyzed the House to force Johnson to abandon his strategy. Johnson had to back down. The hardliners essentially won. The voting bill's status was unclear. Major legislation got held up. The House was paralyzed. And this shows how weak Johnson's control of the House really is. Why does this matter? It matters because it shows the deep divisions within the Republican Party. It matters because it shows how a narrow House majority creates vulnerability and chaos. It matters because it shows that even Trump's priority bills can get held up by internal GOP conflicts. It matters because it shows that the Republican majority is not unified behind any clear agenda. This is significant because it affects major legislation, defense spending, and foreign aid. The headline is misleading because it frames this as Johnson blocking Trump when the reality is the opposite. The reality is that hardline Republicans blocked Johnson's plan while Trump and Johnson were aligned. The headline is backwards. The headline is misleading. The headline is false. Here's what you need to remember. When you see a headline about Johnson blocking Trump, or Trump and Johnson being in conflict, be skeptical. Look at what they actually said about each other. Look at whether they supported the same goals. In this case, Trump and Johnson both supported the voting bill. They just disagreed on strategy. But the headline makes it sound like they were opposing each other when they weren't. The bottom line is this: Mike Johnson did not block Trump's bill. Trump and Johnson both supported the Save America Act. Hardline Republicans blocked Johnson's legislative strategy because they thought it wouldn't work. This was an internal Republican conflict over strategy, not a Johnson versus Trump confrontation. The headline is misleading about who was blocking what and why. This is about cutting through the misleading headlines and explaining what's actually happening in Congress. It's about helping people understand the real conflicts and the real stakes. It's about developing media literacy so you can't be fooled by headlines that frame things backwards. It's about focusing on facts and truth instead of sensational, misleading narratives. Now let's talk more about what this situation tells us about House politics and power dynamics. The House has 435 members total. Currently, Republicans have a narrow majority. That means Republicans control just barely over 217 seats. In such a narrow majority, every single vote matters. If a few Republicans defect on a vote, the majority can disappear. This is a precarious position for leadership. In this situation, with the voting bill and defense bill, the hardliners had enough power to block Johnson's strategy. The hardliners could have voted against Johnson's procedural rule, and they did. That's enough to stop the bill. That's enough to force Johnson to change direction. That's how power works in a narrow majority. A small group of determined members can dictate terms to leadership. Now, in a normal situation, leadership would have leverage over members. Leadership controls committee assignments. Leadership controls campaign support. Leadership controls access to party resources. But when a leadership plan fails on a floor vote, it shows that leadership doesn't have enough control to pass what they want. It shows that leadership is vulnerable to revolts. And yeah, that's what happened here. Johnson's strategy failed. The hardliners won. Johnson had to back down. Now, this also reveals something about Trump's power. Trump is president. Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. Trump wanted Johnson's strategy to work. Trump supported pairing the voting bill with the defense bill. But the hardliners overruled Trump on this issue. The hardliners forced Johnson to change strategy despite Trump's preference. This shows that even Trump can't control every Republican in Congress. Trump's power has limits. Trump's preferences don't automatically become reality in Congress. This is actually a really important lesson about how American government works. The president is powerful, but the president can't just dictate to Congress. Congress has its own power. Congress members have their own interests and preferences. Congress members can vote against the president's preferred strategy. Congress members can force the president to work with them instead of just accepting what the president wants. And that's what happened here. The hardliners forced Trump and Johnson to work with them instead of just accepting Johnson's strategy. Now let's also talk about the actual consequences of this House shutdown. The defense bill got stalled. That's a really important bill. That's the bill that authorizes defense spending and defense policies. That's a bill that Congress needs to pass. When that bill gets stalled, it affects the military. It affects defense spending. It affects defense policies. This is serious. Foreign aid legislation also got held up. That's important for America's diplomatic relationships. That's important for implementing American foreign policy. When that legislation gets stalled, it affects America's role in the world and America's diplomatic relationships. This is serious stuff. And other spending legislation got held up too. Bills that Congress needed to pass were blocked because of this internal Republican conflict. This is how internal party conflicts can affect major legislation and major spending. When leadership loses control of their majority, major legislation can get held up. And that's what happened here. The hardliners basically held Congress hostage to force their preferred strategy. They said they wouldn't allow votes on other legislation unless leadership did what they wanted on the voting bill. They froze the House floor, they prevented votes, They paralyzed Congress. And they did this to force leadership to change direction. And yeah, it worked. They got what they wanted. But it also meant that major legislation didn't move. It meant that defense spending got held up. It meant that foreign aid got held up. This is actually a really good example of how power works in Congress. Whoever controls enough votes can force their will on the majority. When the Republican majority is narrow, a small group of determined Republicans can dictate terms to leadership. The hardliners use that power to force their preferred strategy, even though Trump and Johnson preferred a different strategy. And this also shows how precarious Johnson's position as Speaker really is. Johnson only has a few votes to spare. A few defections on any vote can kill Johnson's legislative strategy. A few defections can paralyze the House. Johnson has to constantly negotiate with hardliners and deal with revolts. Johnson has to try to find strategies that the hardliners will accept. This is a very weak position for a speaker to be in. Compare this to when one party has a much larger majority. When a speaker has a large majority, the speaker has much more control. The speaker can lose a few votes and still pass legislation. The speaker doesn't need to negotiate with every single hardliner. The speaker has real power and real control. But Johnson doesn't have that. Johnson has a narrow majority. Johnson has almost no power. Johnson is constantly vulnerable to revolts. And this headline shows exactly that situation. The headline shows Johnson losing control to hardliners who forced him to abandon his strategy. But the headline doesn't frame it that way. The headline frames it as Johnson blocking Trump. The headline makes it sound like Johnson and Trump are on opposite sides. But they're not. They're on the same side. They both wanted the voting bill. They just disagreed with the hardliners on strategy, and the hardliners won. So the real story is about power dynamics in the House. The real story is about how a narrow Republican majority creates vulnerability. The real story is about how hardliners can force leadership to change direction. The real story is about the limits of power, even for a president when the House majority is narrow. But the headline doesn't tell that story. The headline tells a false story about Johnson blocking Trump. The headline is misleading. The headline is backwards. The headline distorts what's actually happening in Congress. This is why we need to be skeptical of political headlines. This is why we need to understand what's actually happening instead of just accepting what headlines claim. Headlines often simplify and distort complex political situations. Headlines often frame things backwards to make them sound more sensational. Headlines often miss the real story in favor of a simpler but false narrative. So when you see a headline about Congress, take a moment to think about it. Ask yourself, who's actually on which side? Ask yourself what they're actually fighting about. Ask yourself what the real story is behind the headline. When you ask these questions, you develop media literacy that protects you from being misled by sensational headlines. And here's one final important point. This wasn't just a one-time event. This was part of a pattern. Back in February, House Republicans also revolted when 3 Republicans joined Democrats to defeat Johnson's attempt to prevent House votes disapproving of Trump's tariffs. So Johnson has had multiple revolts. Johnson has lost control on multiple occasions. Johnson's authority has been challenged repeatedly. This shows that the Republican House majority is unstable. This shows that Johnson's control is weak. This shows that hardliners are willing to force their will on leadership. This shows that internal Republican conflicts can paralyze Congress and prevent major legislation from moving. For Americans, this means that Congress can't reliably pass the legislation it needs to pass. Defense bills can get held up. Spending bills can get held up. Important legislation can be blocked because of internal party conflicts. This affects the functioning of government. This affects America's ability to meet its obligations. So the real story is important. The real story is about the precarious state of Republican control of the House. The real story is about power dynamics and internal conflicts. The real story is about how a narrow majority creates instability. But the headline doesn't tell that story. The headline tells a false story about Johnson blocking Trump. This is exactly why media literacy matters. This is exactly why you need to read beyond headlines. This is exactly why you need to understand what's actually happening instead of just accepting what headlines claim. Headlines distort. Headlines simplify. Headlines often get things backwards. But when you develop the habit of thinking critically about headlines, you become someone who actually understands what's happening in politics, instead of someone who just gets swept up in the drama. The situation with the Save America Act, the Defense Authorization Bill, and the House floor shutdown is a perfect example of how complex political reality gets flattened into misleading headlines. The real story involves multiple actors with different strategies, but similar goals. The real story involves power dynamics, structural weaknesses, and strategic disagreements. The real story is about how governance works in a divided and narrow majority environment. But the headline reduces all of that complexity to a false narrative about Johnson blocking Trump. And that false narrative spreads quickly because it's dramatic and simple. It fits a story people already believe about conflict between Trump and Republican leadership. But it's just not true. The truth is more complicated, but it's also more important to understand if you actually want to know what's happening in American politics. Power beneath the surface, cutting through noise, and misleading narratives to get to the actual truth of what's happening in our government. Informed citizenship starts here.